last 2 weeks, if you recall, we've looked at the first of a list of 4 things in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. We've looked at the teaching of the word. We've looked at fellowship. The key phrase or word or phrase is in verse 42 is they devoted themselves. Other translations say they were constantly doing. It's the idea of a steadfastness. We're doing this continuously. Well, the teaching of the word and that devotion to that makes sense. Sharing the word with each other, gathering to hear the word. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, it's more than just on a Sunday morning for 40 minutes. Sometimes it's 20 minutes, depending on what church you go to. Sometimes it's a movie and a message, depending, right? But it's more than that. It's in each other's homes, in each other's lives, gathering for coffee, sharing the word with each other. That makes sense to constantly devote ourselves to that. Last week it was fellowship. That makes sense to constantly devote ourselves to fellowship, right? Gathering together, forming those relationships and those bonds. That's how you grow. Because remember, this is how do we live upside down? How does the church go from a little ragtag group of 120 in the first chapter of Acts to Acts chapter 17, where they turn the world upside down? Well, there's a lot of growth there. So the teaching of the word is growth and understanding about God, humans, sin, creation. Fellowship is essential to grow as a church community. We get to know each other. We hear each other. We listen to each other. We do life together. But why is the breaking of bread important? And how do you grow from that? That's what I want to consider this morning. How does a church grow through this breaking of the bread that's talked about here? So we're going to dig a little deeper into some context. Today we're focusing on eating bread. Modern humans are obsessed with food in a way that the first century wouldn't have no understanding of because they barely had any. But we have such an abundance, especially here in America, that we're just obsessed with diets. And if you do any kind of a Google search for diet, you're going to find all kinds of things. Some are sketchy, some are healthy. You've got the low carb diet of different kinds, different names. Keto, you've got vegan. And now you've got, I think it's Pegan, where you can eat all the vegan stuff and add fish. So you've got the carnivore diet. That's a newer fad diet where you only eat meat. And so some of you are like, yes, an Alaskan came up with that. I'm sure of it. You've got the paleo diet. There's different things. And they're for health. They're, sometimes they're, lose weight, whatever it is, feel better. I get all that. A few that I found interesting. One is a baby food diet. So you can eat one meal a day, and then in addition, it needs to be a low calorie meal. In addition, you can eat up to 16 jars of baby food every day of your choice. And then, baby food jars, right? So that's very much a low calorie. That's basically a starve yourself to death kind of a diet. There's the master cleanse, which was interesting. Just think through the ramifications of this one. You drink salt water every morning. So not gargle with it after the dentist, but drink it. Then a concoction of a lime or lemon, maple syrup, cayenne pepper, and water. And you drink that throughout the day, and you finish it off with a laxative tea at night. That is the master cleanse. Okay. I think my favorite one that I found, though, was the cotton ball diet. Register that in your head. The cotton ball diet. You eat up to 5 cotton balls dipped in orange juice, lemonade, or a smoothie, if you prefer. You eat the cotton balls. And if you don't think that one's real, it's on Wikipedia. Cotton ball diet. So we know it's true, right? But the cotton ball diet, in fact, I found one article that said 4 ways the cotton ball diet could kill you. And I'm thinking there's only one way was necessary. Eating the cotton balls. That could kill you. Why do you need 3 other possible ways? But we're obsessed with food. We're obsessed with food. But in the first century, they didn't have that luxury. They didn't have the luxury of being obsessed with food. In fact, the basics of food, if they had just the basics, if you were poor, you were either pretty wealthy and that was a small percentage or you were the poor, they were just happy. It was considered a blessing just to have bread. Just to have bread. Meat was a rare treat. And if they had it, it was small amounts to season and flavor everything else. Honestly, many first century people lived on a daily diet of bread and a little bit of olive oil because that was plentiful, and wine, water, and that was it. Maybe a few vegetables to add to that. So I say all that because it's important to when we really think about what does this breaking bread mean. For the first century Jewish person or the first century person, but we're focusing here primarily on the Jews because those were the early believers. Breaking bread together was a daily thing, was often the main course. But what does Luke mean in Acts 2:42 when he says they broke bread together? Well, I believe he has two meanings. One, it means simply sharing of food. And for context, go to verse 46 of chapter 2. Again, he's explaining further what this means. Verse 46, and day by day, attending the temple together, so that's the large gathering we talked about last Sunday, and breaking bread in their homes, the small gathering. So part of that breaking of the bread was just eating together. Because fellowship doesn't always include eating. Sometimes it's just going out on a hike on the butte and just being together and enjoying each other's company. But there's something even more intimate about sharing food together. Acts 27:35, same thing. What's happening there is basically Paul's about to have a shipwreck in Acts chapter 27, and there's a moment where he breaks bread. He prays over it, breaks the bread, and they get a little meal because stomach's upset and they're about to endure some, they got this storm going on. And that was obviously not the Lord's table. He's like, hey guys, let's do communion real quick as we're about to shipwreck here. No, that was just breaking of the bread together, right? So I think that is part of it. And if you really think about it, is there a more close and intimate way to really just be together as friends and as believers than eating a meal together? If you really think about it, it's not just having people in our house, it's taking time to quiet ourselves and we've got food, we've got the smells of food, we've got no agenda, just enjoying that time. But that's a vulnerability, right? To invite people over for food, what if they don't like it? What if you're nervous? What if you're an introvert? And that's understandable. And what if they see my house and it's a mess and all those things? It doesn't look like the cover of a Martha Stewart magazine or this perfection. And so we avoid that. But in the first century, there was no such avoidance. That was very common in that culture to eat together and to break bread together often. In fact, they would sit close in such a way because rooms there were not big open spaces like we have, big houses, big buildings. They would sit tightly and they would often lean on the person next to them. Talk about, right? That, talk about things like COVID or whatever. It's like just leaning and just coughing all over each other. But that's how they did things. And they would eat, usually would lean to the left and could dip, with the right hand and eat that way. But there was a closeness there. And they would often eat together in a way of the host would have a large loaf of bread and they would break that and break it off and give it to people and share that way off the same food. Again, we have things today like hygiene that, we understand germs in ways that they didn't, but that was part of the culture. But if you think about it, how does that grow a church? How does that grow a church? There's a bond there. Right? Just in the time we've been here, and I've been told by a few people, well, Alaskans don't really invite each other over for dinner. Well, it's my job then, my goal, along with my wife, to break that trend as much as we can, because Kansans are the same way. I've lived in Arkansas. Arkansonians, whatever, that's a different country, but whatever they speak down there, they're the same. What people are hesitant to gather together and to live upside down, we push through that hesitancy and say, come on over. But Christians don't do this much. Let me give you an example without naming the name of the church. We went to a church and we decided, well, because whatever church we've been to, whether it's serving on staff as a pastor, attending as a missionary or whatever, we've always invited people over. It's just part of the DNA, especially from my wife, and I've loved that part of her. So we decided one time to get real radical. This is a church when nobody was really inviting people over. We invited the entire church. It's like 125 people. Served them at our house. We lived on a 10-acre farm outside of Kansas City, served them all, and had a great time. There was never any expectation of reciprocation, but we never got invited to anybody's house after that. It's like, you don't have to invite the whole church, just invite someone, invite a family, right? But even the churches are hesitant to do that. Yet the first century church did it daily. Not just once a month or, hey, we're going to do a quarterly thing where everybody sign up and invite a family over. Okay, well, busy, daily. There was just a desire to, let's gather together. Even if it's the simplest thing. Let's break bread together. So I think part of Acts 2:42 is just simply sharing food together. And there's a beauty to that. There's a closeness. It promotes understanding. It builds relationships. You listen to each other. You hear each other's struggles because people are more willing maybe to share if it's just you, like one family over to another family's house and it's not a big Bible study or things where they're uncomfortable sharing. And they can be like, yeah, I'm really struggling right now. Or this is going on. Can you pray for me? There's this health issue. And you can share those things. But I also think it means the Lord's table in Acts 2:42. So I think the meaning is both. Because during this time, the Christians would gather together for what was called the love feast or the agape feast. Jude chapter 1, verse 12, you don't have to look it up, but you can write it down. Jude mentions the love feast because he says, basically, there's false teachers, there's bad people coming in disrupting your love feast. So when Jude wrote that, it had already had a common name of a love feast. There was a gathering, and that sounds like very hippie culture thing, but it was just a time of Christians gathering and having fun and laughing, and there was food, and there was wine, and there was whatever. And so but there was not drunkenness. There was a control to that. And yet they laughed so much and they were so joyful that the world around them thought they were a bunch of drunks. Right? So it was the love feast. And then after that love feast, they would always have the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, communion, whatever you're used to calling that. Right afterwards, it would just be a natural extension to break bread and do the Lord's table. So both of those things are happening here. And as we think about what you might, your church background or lack of background or whatever, you might call it different things. Communion, some people call it. If you have a Catholic background or something, you might call it the Eucharist. The Lord's Supper is common. That's a phrase that Paul writes. He uses that phrase in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, or the Lord's table, whatever you call it. I want to use this object lesson to kind of think through what it means. In our home, we have several pictures around. I'm sure you do too. You have photos of different people. Pictures are a reminder of memories, things that happened in the past. Pictures are a reminder of our love for people, especially what we feel for them presently, current day, even if it's people that have passed on. Pictures are a reminder of longing to see loved ones who are gone from this earth. So they're a reminder of what we experienced in the past. They're a reminder of our feelings in the present, and they're a reminder of our hope for the future. So here's a picture of us. This is the crew that moved to Alaska. Well, minus me, so just add me in there. Photoshop my big head in there. Okay, so there's my wife. And this was a few years ago, but this is the 5 girls. So this was hanging in the house, and I grabbed it. That's 7 of us, but that's not complete. Okay, so this is a more complete picture of all of us, of all 9 of us. There's 2 people that are missing, though. They're not here. So what does this picture do? When I see them, and it's hanging in my office right above my desk, and I see that, and I think, man, what's Josiah doing in Nicaragua? How's he doing? What's he learning from the Lord? What are his struggles? And I pray for him. And I think about Ethan, just turned 18, young man, keeping track of a house, living life and transitioning to adulthood. And I think about that, and I sometimes cry and think, oh man, wish I could be with him and hear his voice and see his face. You see where I'm going with that? It stirs up memories and feelings and anticipations of the future. Some pictures, though, are people that are just gone. They're not here. This is my father-in-law. You don't know him. If you know Jesus, you'll know him someday. He's in heaven with his Lord. Passed away suddenly at the age of 63 in 2007. And every time I think about him, I cry. Because he was a friend. He wasn't just my father-in-law. So pictures are a reminder of the past, events. Pictures are a reminder of our present affections. And pictures are a reminder of the hope of the future. Is this not the same thing? The Lord's table, the Lord's Supper, is a reminder of the past. What has been done, a reminder of our affections for Christ now, and a reminder of the hope of seeing him face to face. So keep that image in mind as we continue. I really believe we need to orient ourselves around, and by the way, every time we do the Lord's Supper, I'm not going to do an entire sermon on the Lord's Supper, but this just was an appropriate dovetailing of the two. A couple points to think about. I really think the Lord's table helps us to look in the proper direction. First of all, we've got to look back. We have to look back. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24 and 25. This is Paul writing. The church at Corinth had almost every problem you can imagine. They were doing things wrong pretty consistently, and Paul had to scold them a lot. So 1 Corinthians 11, they were even getting the Lord's table wrong. Okay? But first of all, so in this, he tells them to look back at what Christ had revealed to him and what Christ had said. Verse 24, it says, when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup. Cup is the new covenant in my blood. So what's Paul saying? Hey, you've brought in a bunch of junk to the Lord's Supper, to the Lord's table. You've brought in fighting and division and then things that shouldn't be there. You need to orient your gaze back to Jesus. You need to go back to what he has done and what he has said. So that's the first thing we have to look back. And I'm going to briefly just connect this to Passover. Because what we have to understand, I think we miss this in the modern day. I think we miss what all four of these things in Acts 2:42 really meant to the first century church. I think we miss this. I don't think we do prayer quite like they did. I don't think we quite do fellowship like they did. I don't think we break bread like they did. And again, we're not promoting legalism, but just an understanding of what made this church so vibrant and growth happened. So briefly, the Lord's Supper, what we say is communion, is connected to the Last Supper of Christ. And you might know the story. Let me just say a few things here. There's a whole long list of things that a Jewish person would do, or they gather in groups or families, and they would do what's called the Seder meal. They would do the Last Supper meal as they look back and remember Passover and God bringing them out of Egypt and saving them from the slavery that they were under. And it was at that meal that Jesus and all these good Jewish boys, and probably some ladies were there too, were gathering and doing this Passover meal, as good Jews did every year. And in that Passover meal, there was no deviation from what was said and the order and the meaning. Everybody knew it. It was rote. It was memorized, basically, like Christmas carols today. We just know them. You start hearing them, you can probably sing all of the words. We just know that that's what you say. You don't make up new lyrics. That's the song. Same thing with the Passover if you were Jewish. You didn't add anything to it. You didn't monkey with it. Well, in the entire meal, Jesus monkeyed with everything and blew their mind. So there was 4 cups of wine that they drank, and there's no wine in here, but there are 4 cups of wine. So the first cup, and you don't have to look these up, the cup of sanctification, Jesus, that's in Luke chapter 22, verses 17 and 18, if you want to look that up, but he basically says that he starts the Passover meal at that point. He's leading it. He's the host, okay? And then you're supposed to have a washing of hands. There's other things you do, but that's the next big thing. The host is to wash their hands and show, that they're sanctified and basically set apart. And it's then that Jesus doesn't do that. He gets down. And he says he girds himself up with a thing like a slave or a servant would do. Their minds had to be like, the host is to be there at the front of the table, a place of leadership. What is he doing? And he gets down. And he washes the most dirty part of a first century person was their feet, because they wore sandals everywhere. And he washes their feet. Minds are blown at that point, but we're not done. So then they partake of the meal, but they had to be thinking, what was that? And then they're eating the meal, and there's the lamb, and there's bitter herbs, and there's the sweet karaseth, the sop, and different things. And they're eating all these things, and they're supposed to be thinking about the Passover out of Egypt and the salvation that Yahweh, Jehovah, provided for them, not realizing the Lord, Adonai, is in their presence, the Son of God. And then after the meal was eaten, there was it was basically a dessert piece of bread, because they've already had bread. And at this point, they've had 2 cups of wine, and the 3rd cup of wine is coming. And so the bread was called the afikomen. It's basically after bread. You would eat it after the lamb and everything. And it was supposed to linger. You're supposed to eat it slowly. The host would break it up, give it to everybody. You're to eat it slowly so that it lingers. And it's here when they're eating the after bread, and you're to have it linger so that you're thinking about the lamb that you ate, what God had done, all these things that you heard about God's salvation. It is here where Jesus says, this is my body, which is given to you. Do this in remembrance of me. As he's breaking the bread, which was tradition, he adds to it. Oh, by the way, this is not what you think it is. This is my body given to you. And so then, again, their mind has to be blown. What are you talking about? We're focusing on the lamb. You're changing things, man. We're focusing on the lamb, Exodus, Egypt, and he is again blowing their mind. Let's go further. Then they were to do the 3rd cup. And the 3rd cup was to be poured, and then a blessing was to be given, and then the 3rd cup was to be consumed. It was called the cup of redemption. Fitting. The cup where they were to think about God redeemed us, meaning he purchased us. He bought us out of Egypt. He brought us out of Egypt, but bought us out of Egypt as well. He purchased that by his power. It is here that Jesus adds new meaning to the cup of redemption. So he's already turned them upside down with washing their feet instead of being above them. He's turned it upside down by saying the whole meal of sacrifice that you've thought about has a new meaning. And now he says this cup of redemption has a new meaning. This is my blood. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Going back to Jeremiah chapter 31, a new covenant I will put in you. I will take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. So we have to look back and see that this is deeply connected to the Passover, the history of God's salvation with the Jews. And Jesus is saying, hey, I'm the better sacrifice. I'm the once and for all sacrifice for the sins that you commit. We have to look ahead. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So it's a proclamation to say, Christ died, that's the past event, but he's coming again. And in the meantime, our present affections have to be aligned to him in a proper way. So we have to look ahead. We also have to look around. What was the problem here at Corinth? Verse 17, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you. He's about to scold them. Because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And I believe it. So he knew them enough to go, yeah, I probably could name the troublemakers, right? It's Paul's thinking. For there must be factions among you. Verse 20, when you come together, it is not the Lord's table that you eat. In other words, they thought, again, they were doing the common meal, the agape meal, and then communion. They thought all is good. And Paul's like, you're not. Because what was happening is the rich people were bringing huge amounts of food and being gluttonous with it and eating and weren't sharing. And there were those that were hungry and poor and they didn't have any food. And there was favoritism. There was all kinds of lack of unity. And Paul's saying, no, look around. Because you're way off course with how you should be thinking through this time. So it's not only looking back to what Christ has done, it's looking ahead to him coming again. It's looking around to saying, man, am I a cause for discord? Am I a cause for a lack of unity? Are we doing this with the right purpose? And then finally, we look within. We look in us. 1 Corinthians 11:28. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Let a person examine himself. And I thought about that this week of what that means. And that is something that I think growing up in my experience, communion, and this is no fault of my dad was my pastor, so if he's listening, sorry, Dad. But it wasn't necessarily the church leaders. I think it was just church culture has almost been like the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table is a tack on. We just do it once a month. And even Stephen and I a few weeks ago were talking. It's like, when did you do it weekly? Do you do it monthly? Does frequency matter? We don't know. But it's a heart thing. And I think growing up in a Christian culture in America, I just never really felt like communion had any weight. I never really felt like it was something that was like, okay, the service is almost over. We're going to do communion and pray. And Lord, help me. I'm a sinner. I'm a horrible wretch and all that. And you just do it again next month and you're good. In fact, some people were the C&E Christians, Christmas and Easter Christians, and then some were the C&E plus communion Christians. They'd come once a month and kind of get their little fix and go. And so I felt like it was a lot of that, and there was no real meaning to it. Felt like it was disconnected. Now, I'm not saying we go back to the first century, because there they would have the loaf and they would all eat from the same loaf. You'd break it off and just do it. But then they'd all drink from the same goblet or chalice. And, and even some traditions still do that today. And it's like, oh, that's disgusting. If that's the case, you want to get first in line so you don't have the crumbs in the backwash. But I'm not saying we go back there, but have we not lost something by now even, some churches are doing the little COVID thing that I call it COVID communion still, where it's like, you do the one thing and it's this wafer that was made for World War I soldiers, I think it was. And then you do the juice, which just tastes like it's been sitting there since World War I, but not in a good way, like heated or something. It's not. But so it's like, that's that extreme. We don't want to go back and drink from the same goblet, but have we missed it? I wonder if we've missed the weight of it. And what's interesting is at the beginning of Acts, they were doing this daily. And I'm not saying we should do it daily. By Acts 20, they were doing it weekly. It says, but at the first day of the week, they were doing and breaking, bread together. And that's what many churches do today, is weekly. Frequency doesn't matter. but it's the heart. It's where we look and how we reflect. Paul says to examine ourselves, not to see if we're worthy, because we ain't. We're not. If we examine ourselves and go, oh man, I'm not worthy of this, that's not what Paul's saying. He's not saying to see if you're worthy. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. I don't think anywhere in there you could say Paul is saying examine yourself, see if you're worthy and good enough before God to drink this. Because that's not the point. Jesus dying on the cross made us worthy of coming to him because he first came to us. That's not the point. It's saying, are we doing it in a worthy manner? Are we doing it with a worthy purpose? The purpose of seeing what Christ has done and then reflecting on our own sin. And Johanna, since the kids were little, every time we observe the Lord's table is over there whispering to them, reminding them, hey, this is what Jesus did. And let's take a moment and really examine the sin in our life. Let the Holy Spirit sweep clean the cobwebs and the inner corners of our heart and our mind before we observe this. And to really reflect and say, Christ, you made me clean. I'm not acting in a clean way. Clean my heart. Create in me a clean heart, O God, David says. Psalm 139, search me, O God, know my heart. Test me, know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you. Lead me along the path of everlasting life. I think, how does this grow the church? I think the teaching of the word gives us the right knowledge about God. Fellowship gives us the right love from God. Breaking of bread gives us the right affections for God. It helps align our heart to this so that we see the weight of it, we see the importance, and then we let the Spirit apply it where he needs to. Because my situation, my wart, my junk, my sin is going to be mine, and yours is going to be yours.